Hello, welcome to the Exchange Podcast. I'm your host, Ari Hirschberg, Director of Digital Community and Engagement at the Exchange Lab. We're recording this on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples, and today we're doing a deep dive into your questions from the Digital BC live stream, Walking the Talk, Lessons Learned from Developing Policy in the Open. So joining me today are two people who work directly on creating the Digital Code of Practice, Director of Digital Strategy, Amy Kirtay, and Team Lead Product Owner of the Digital Code of Practice, Annie Goodwin. We're going to cover topics today like what does it mean to work in the open, where have Amy and Annie found resistance to working in the open, and even what is working in the open, and more. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So, let's go. Question number one. Can you explain what it means to work in the open and why that is valuable for public servants?
Yeah, for sure. So working in the open means showing people the work you're doing as you're doing it. At its very least, it's showing your team and the people across the organization that you're in some of the efforts you're making. But at best, it's sharing publicly. So this would be with stakeholders outside your organization who generally would have an interest in what you're doing. Working in the open is not just about demonstrating progress, but also talking openly about, mistakes, changes, and things you've learned. It's partly to support communications, to help you build a movement for change, but it's also about just general good governance. It also gives stakeholders a view into the work that you're doing, which in turn drives up quality and helps you unblock any things that you encounter and manage those dependencies you might have. And just in general, working in the open is about being open about the work you're doing.
I think that last line is so interesting and something that was really important when we were developing the code, because to us, working in the open wasn't about creating something else to share, but really just sharing the work that we were doing. It shouldn't be something extra. It should just be sharing what's already happening.
And do either of you have any stories of working in the open that you can share from your team?
Yeah, so I think some of the things that we encountered and just the way we did it was we tried to use tools that would enable not only public servants' ability to see what we were doing, but also folks in the vendor community. So we used an internal engagement tool which allowed folks to see who's making comments, and you could upvote comments, so kind of similar to Reddit. And then if you were an external individual that wanted to look at the code, we had a draft version of it on a public-facing website, which is pretty unheard of for public services. Usually that stuff's pretty locked down before it goes through executive approvals. And we just tried to be super open with it. And we wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to have an input on a piece of policy that was going to impact them. And I think, we have a lot of really intelligent people across BC Public Service and beyond that across the world that are doing some really amazing things in digital government spaces. And we wanted to ensure that they had a chance to participate. And so being super open and using engagement tools, social media, blogging, it enabled us to just get that out there. And everyone had a chance to provide what they thought about it.
Yeah, and I think the second half of that is as we were getting all of that feedback on the open draft that we'd published, we tried to be as open as we could about what we were doing with that feedback. So on the bottom of each practice of our draft, we had a change log which recorded, what we had changed and why we changed it from that initial draft. So it was, being very open in the way we were accepting feedback, but also in the way we were sharing what we were doing with that feedback.
Any cultural notices from that?
Well, maybe less cultural in the sense of diversity of culture, but it was unheard of for a lot of folks. I think a lot of individuals are used to seeing something fully polished before it's released, and we were putting something out that was not. And so while, we're taking care of things like spelling mistakes and whatnot, it was not in its final form, and we knew that. And so we were just really open about the fact that hey, this is a draft. We want to know what you think. It's probably going to change and it's going to have to go through formal approvals, but this is your chance to provide input. And, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Is there another example of working in the open that you'd like to practice in the future?
So I have this utopian vision of an open backlog of policy initiatives. So there's a lot of groups across government that work on policy. Often that's very specific to their ministry. But I think what we're starting to find is that there's a lot of spaces where a piece of policy might have implications in different contexts. And we see that quite a bit with the differentiation between like technology and digital. The waters are getting muddy. And I think if we have an open backlog of what we call policy problems, so like older policies that have just been ingrained forever that we're just following, that might not suit our needs in this modern era, maybe there's a bunch of different policy groups that could provide input or support on that. Or like if we're all working on these problems collaboratively together, we're going to end up with a better outcome. So I have this idea that perhaps we could share like one backlog and all collaborate on these things. Another area that I think could potentially work is more collaborations with academia. So there's a lot of folks that are external to government that really care and want to be part of the development process of their governments. They're partners and can be collaborators. And I think the universities and colleges are great hubs for that. And I think if we can find new and innovative ways to engage with them through like things like hackathons or other collaborative efforts, it's going to help us build that next generation of public servants, but also create a really good public service civil connection and allow folks to have a say in their government in a way that they might not have had in the past, or perhaps they've only ever voted or are new to voting. Like that might be the only way they've ever engaged with their government. And so if we can create these spaces for them to come and say like, this was going to impact me, I think we should do this. That's going to go real far.
I really like that idea. It breaks just one group working on it, but it brings everyone into it and gives them an investment.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things, especially for universities, is that's a cool place for you to kind of learn and grow as an individual and figure out what you might want to do in your later parts of your life. And sometimes we don't know what that looks like, and we don't even know what options are out there. And so if we can support some of these folks that are looking for what does that next step look like, and offer them an opportunity to show that like the public service is a viable career option, perhaps, they'd be more interested in supporting things like working on policy, or even knowing that being a policy analyst, you actually get the chance to work on some cool things. Like we're not all stuffy folks.
And I think it also gives us a perspective that we don't always get in the public service, right? Like we get folks maybe from a more international perspective or that more academic perspective, and that's something we don't always have.
In your opinion, what are some of the biggest barriers to working in the open in government? Do you have any advice on how to navigate these?
Yeah, I think what we found in the development of the Code of Practice and the open draft, was really managing ego and managing expectations was really hard. Some of that was our own expectations on how we wanted people to interact with the open draft. And some of that was other people's expectations on what they thought a cross-government policy should look like and the engagement on that policy should look like. I think that there's something really vulnerable about providing your feedback in that open venue and having anyone in government be able to see your feedback, reply to it, upvote it. That's tough. And I think that really conflicted with some people's sort of perceptions of hierarchy in government and how they wanted their comments to be, interacted with and be dealt with. And then in terms of, advice on navigating those challenges, I think for us, really having the support of our leadership was huge. Just being able to rely on our leadership and ask questions and just have that support. And then also just approaching the engagement and the open draft with a lot of humility and really recognizing that there is an element of vulnerability and those feelings are totally valid and those sensitivities are totally valid. There's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable. It's about learning how to just sit with that discomfort.
So two things that came up that I heard a few times in that response is ego and then humility at the end. So ego, if you did this again with the same group, do you think just by doing it once, it would calm it down even just a little bit, just to like people, I've seen what this is like. I'd be a little bit better at that. Or do you think it'll take a while to get this kind of vulnerability established?
I think for some folks, going through it once and realizing it's really not so bad, I think that would help. The second kick at the can. I think for others, it might take more. I think it's a process, right? And everyone kind of has their own timelines and like feelings on how long it takes for them to feel comfortable with this. And I don't know, there are some people that maybe will never feel comfortable with this, and that's fine.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. It's such a huge change management for doing something for 10 years, 20 years, maybe a 30-year career, and then flipping it on its head.
Because effectively, in some ways, a lot of folks have gone their entire government careers without working in the open in this way. They're used to putting out a very polished product that has gone through iterations internally with a very small subset of group of folks. So now all of a sudden we're flipping that on its head and saying, no, let's just be totally open. And like, that might not come naturally to a lot of people, especially if they spent, 10, 20, 30 years doing the exact opposite. And that behavior change takes a while. So,
and I think there's also a personality piece to it. Like, there are some people that aren't comfortable, right, with being vulnerable in a professional setting, right? Sharing their thoughts in that way, or their open draft or unfinished thoughts. I think there is also like a personality piece that's everyone needs to find a way that's genuine to them. It's going to be different depending on who you are and where you are and what you're doing.
I agree. And to your thoughts, Amy, you get so good at doing something some way, you're great at it.
Yeah, for sure. And we don't ever want to do anything that's career limiting or that harms people at the end of the day, especially citizens of the province that we serve. So I think, sometimes we get a little bit in our head about it, but that behavior change is hard. And, recognizing that it's not going to come easily to everybody. And to Annie's point, that there's certain personalities that might be more open to trying things. We got those early adopters that are like keeners, and then others that are a little cautious and take their time getting used to that kind of thing. And that's totally okay. But I think that's where like sharing of successes, communicating, and just the theme of being open about the stuff and talking about the good and the bad and learning from those experiences that others have had goes a long way in building that sense of comfort with the discomfort.
Yes, even I've heard people say more and more, like, just even being silent for a second, let alone something this big.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so in your experience, where have you found the most resistance?
Yeah, it's a great question, a tough question though. And it's hard because, government, BC government is not a homogenous group. Like, there's a lot of diversity across the public service. There's a really wide range of, like we were saying, personalities, experiences, cultures. But I think the commonalities on where we did find those sort of pockets of resistance, it was really where there was an established culture of risk aversion and a commitment to hierarchy, really, that like traditional government hierarchy. And where we did feel that resistance, I definitely felt it at the analyst level and at the exec level within those sort of pockets of government, which I think makes sense. I think staff need to feel supported to experiment and try something new. And where there isn't that support, I don't know how staff could. I think that support's just essential.
I think another thing to consider too is like every ministry has its own cultures, norms, and values. And what works in one space doesn't necessarily work in another. And the acknowledgement that these are established cultural norms, and I'm using the term culture more loosely to talk about work culture and work environment, where one might find resistance in one place might not be the same in somewhere else. And I think the recognition that has developed over time. And so one might use different tactics to connect with those groups than one might use in a different ministry. So just recognizing that, I think, is also helpful.
Yeah, that's huge. It's huge. Every ministry has a very different, a lot of the times, set of way of working.
Truly.
And sometimes there's, legitimate reasons for that. Like, it's not a bad thing that we're all different. I think there's reasons in history there. It's about, we're, like Amy said, working with it, not against it. We shouldn't all be a homogenous group.
Are you able to describe other ways that someone might be able to work in the open, particularly when not working on a policy project? And can it be used in technical projects instead?
So, great question. Our colleague in the digital office, Martha Edwards, wrote a great Medium article on this and gave some great examples for people to work in the open in their like personal practice as well as teams. And we'll make sure that we link that in the show notes. But some of the things that she gave, just on a personal level were like things from like setting your calendar permissions so people can see what you're working on and what kind of meetings you're going to, asking your questions publicly, even when it's a little bit vulnerable to do so, using open communication channels like Teams or Yammer instead of like just sending one person an email. I think those kinds of personal things are a great first step and something you can do if you're working on a policy project, if you're working on something more technical, if you're, working operations. Like there's a lot of ways to integrate this practice and this way of working in your everyday.
I'm going to touch on the technical part because it's interesting to think about working in the open on technical projects in the public service. So some of the things that we've seen that have worked really well is getting away from like memos or status reports where it's just, are you red, are you green, or are you yellow? And doing things like demos. So I hear the term demos, not memos, show the thing. So really just promoting and encouraging folks to come forward and be more forthcoming about what they're working on, even if it's not fully polished or finished. Even doing things like open sprint reviews or just opening things up, like Annie said, to other folks, even if you're developing or you don't have a forthcoming release, but you're still kind of getting ready for that. One of the interesting things that we had come up on a technical project that we were doing is we had an instance where we realized, and we heard it through the grapevine, that there was another group that was doing a very similar initiative with somewhat overlapping audiences. And we reached out to them and said, like, hey, what are you guys up to? Like, we think we're doing something similar. And then we heard through someone else that there was someone else doing something similar. So we were all working on what we thought were similar problems, possibly different audiences. We weren't quite sure. So we all got together and we called it an ecosystem alignment session. And we brought a bunch of kind of technical folks together to just share what they were doing, who your audiences are, what problem are you trying to solve? Let's just get together and talk about it. And what actually happened is we were all able to start to collaborate more effectively. Some of the groups realized that they could actually work together to build a technical solution that would fit both their needs. There was also the realization that there were some groups that probably would have projects converging like a year or so out. So it just really offered an opportunity for us to think a little bit more holistically about the technology we were building and just see if there's areas for overlap or use of things like common components. So similar things building blocks that we could use to build pieces of technology for program and service delivery. So it is possible to do it in very technical environments. The initiative just has to be there, I think.
I like in your answer how you shared how relationships were formed that would never have been formed.
Yeah. And all it took was like, hey, I think you're doing something cool. We're doing something cool. Let's talk about it. And like maybe there's opportunities for overlap. And, it was a bit of a Venn diagram where it wasn't completely one for one, but it even just allowed some good relationships to be created. My network increased. We got to know other folks across the organization. And I think one of the nice things about that when you're working in technical environments like that, where it's like, hey, every ministry has like a technical group or a group that's working on technology. And so like having connections into those groups are super helpful. And, even just something like a quick coffee to be like, hey, we're working on this thing. Like, this is the problem we're trying to solve. Here's how we think we're going to do it. Any thoughts? Like, you don't have to give all of the details, but you can talk in broad strokes. And like people that like working on technology are pretty stoked to usually talk about it. So like it's an easy thing to do.
And I've done that too. That coffee that tends to be enjoyable, you can save so many hours.
Oh my gosh. And dollars all over a coffee.
Any final thoughts?
I think some final thoughts are just, I'm really appreciative to have worked on an initiative like this. It's something totally unique, very different. And it's been great to see just the engagement that we've gotten, not only from public servants, but those across the world and academia and, the vendor community that has, really stepped up and supported us in this. And some of whom even just responded with like, this is amazing. Like, here's how it's going to impact us. We want to be a part of this. So I think it's really shown the importance of this and the value that comes from this approach when you're working on something like this, where it impacts so many people beyond just the public servants that I initially thought would be impacted by it. So, and I'm thankful for all, the leadership support that we had and just the people that were in our corner. And, it wasn't always rosy. Like, we had some tough challenges that we came into, and, some days were harder than others, but we had a great team that was working on this. And as a result, a great extended community that really helped us get to where we are today. So, I really appreciate for that and the experiences through this work.
Yeah, I think I have a couple thoughts. I think something that I didn't expect coming into this project was really that working in the open and publishing an open draft in this way, I think it's more of a soft skill than a hard skill. And it's a really important soft skill. And it involves being vulnerable, being honest, being genuine, building relationships, building connections. Something I didn't expect, but I think I learned really quickly. And I think the other final thought is a connection to the digital code of practice. So this is the open draft that we published and is now out. So within the code of practice and the development of it and all the conversations around it, we really learned quickly that there are so many connections between those 10 practices, and to do one well, you have to do the rest of them well. And work in the open is one of our practices. And another one of our practices is to take an ecosystem approach. So to take an ecosystem approach is to consider the entire digital government ecosystem in your work. And that includes the role that your product plays in the ecosystem and how it'll impact other users, your colleagues, and other stakeholders, how you can design your product or your service to integrate and communicate easily with other systems, and how you can use reusable technology to simplify your work. Also, I think how you can contribute your work or your team's resources for sort of the greater good and to support other teams in the ecosystem. So what I'm trying to say is there's a huge connection between working in the open and that ecosystem approach. I think to do one well, you have to do both well, because you need to be proactive about sharing what you're doing, but also be really aware of what your colleagues are doing and what else is happening across the public service and what connections, what alignment, what else is happening there.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Thanks again, Amy and Annie, for taking your time to share your thoughts. I really appreciate it. To the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode, Walking the Talk, Lessons Learned from Developing Policy in the Open. You can connect with me at ari.hirschberg@gov.bc.ca or click the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.